Hi, I'm Tim Richardson with the Walker Church of Christ in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I know many of you I've known for many years, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I recognize that there are some that, even though we have resumed our regular worship service at the Walker congregation at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings, we are limiting our assemblies and skipping some of the rest of them, but we're making time to be together. But I recognize that there are some that are still not able to do that, but for both age or health, that it's advisable for you to be extra cautious, because we're still dealing with a very serious health issue, and we don't want anybody to get sick. And I know that there are some who've passed away, and we're needing to take all of this very, very seriously. But I appreciate those of you who do take the time to listen. I want to go back in time for a moment just to mention an incident. When I was a teenager, and I know that's been a long time ago, I was in a classroom with some of my fellow students. There wasn't any class going on, and I was just overhearing some things that other people were saying. And I don't know how it came about, but something had been said about the golden rule, and comments started coming out, things like, well, doesn't it say do unto others before they do unto you, or something along that line. And the reason I mention that is because it simply illustrates that sometimes people are fully aware of what the Bible actually says. The golden rule comes from some statements that Jesus made in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. But the fact that some person may know what it says doesn't mean that they take it seriously. It doesn't mean that they necessarily want to build their lives on the principles that are involved. The fact is that even people who know what Jesus taught quite often live by totally different principles. It's been suggested that on the one hand you've got the golden rule, and I want to read what Jesus said in just a moment, but in describing human behavior, that you also have a silver rule and a bronze rule and an iron rule, and these are simply different ways of describing the principles that people actually live by, the kind of values that they reflect in their lives. Now, what Jesus actually said, and I want to give you this twice, the King James translation that is familiar to so many people, has Jesus saying here, all things therefore, whatsoever you would that men should do to you, even so do to them. And using the New American Standard Translation, which makes the language here a little bit more current, says, in everything therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. The principle that Jesus is advocating there is that treating people not the way they have treated you, or not the way you expect them to be treating you, or not the way that you wouldn't want anybody to treat you, and so you avoid treating them that way. But Jesus is indicating that if you look at all of the instructions that God had given people down through the centuries, down through human history, that the law that God had given to the people of Israel, which is the nation with which he had a covenant relationship in order to prepare for the coming of Jesus, that the laws that he gave them, and the Ten Commandments are a summary of that, but there were actually hundreds of laws that God gave that covered every aspect of their lives. And the prophets were those that over different generations God sent in order to remind people of how he wanted them to live, to warn them when they were not living as they should. And so the prophets were God's messengers to try to communicate with people and urge them to remember how much God cared and the importance of walking with him and living in accordance with his will. And Jesus is saying here that even though there are so many different principles that God had advocated over the generations, that all of them boil down to this. This is the real summary of all of them. That is, treat people the way you want to be treated. Now, there are a lot of people in the world who are fully aware of what Jesus said here. They recognize that it's by many people called the golden rule. But they don't really feel like it's even practical. They don't choose to live this way. There are those critics who feel like it's not even a good idea, or it's not possible to live this way. And so you've got not only a golden rule, but you've got also a silver rule, a bronze rule, and an iron rule. And each of these terms describes how people tend to live. We don't all fit in exactly the same category. We don't all build our choices on exactly the same principles. But the values that we live by, they're reflected in one of these four ideas. One of the things that is most traumatic to the human family is the idea of an iron rule. The iron rule is the rule by force. And this is what has been reflected so many times down through human history. This is where the conflicts come from. This is why wars are fought. Because the iron rule is might makes right. Or if I'm strong enough to pull it off, I can do whatever I choose to do. If I'm big enough, I can do it. And it's this principle that down through the centuries has been the foundation for so many conflicts. And we can go back for centuries and centuries, but we can look at things like the Bible talks about the Babylonian Empire that eventually conquered the Israelite people because God was trying to teach them a lesson because they weren't listening to him. You have the Babylonian Empire being replaced by that of the Medes and Persians, and then you've got Alexander the Great, his Greek Empire, and then the Romans replaced his. And all of these illustrate historically efforts to build kingdoms based on this same principle. We're strong, we can do what we want to, we can run over people, we can take what we choose, and that's how many people have lived. In more recent generations, we can look back at things like the Civil War, where you've got two sides, each of them feeling like they were right and having a great tragic conflict with each other. You have the World War II, where Adolf Hitler and others that supported him were trying to say that our group of people is better than anybody else. And so as a result of that mentality, they said it doesn't matter if we try to get rid of the Jews or any other people. And as long as we can get what we want, that's what matters. And we're strong enough to do it, and so we can have our own way. And so the iron rule is that of force, people not regarding how other people feel or not regarding what is good for other people, but simply saying, this is what I want and I'm big enough to pull it off. You also have what some people call a silver rule. And that's kind of a negative principle, even though there are those that feel like, no, this is a reasonable way to live. And it's stated as, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. And so it's saying there that if you don't want people treating you this way, then don't treat somebody else this way. Now, that doesn't give you any obligations as far as you actually do, but it means that you're restricting your behavior. And where it leaves people then is if you agree not to hurt me, then I won't hurt you. And so it's not urging people what they have to do to somebody else, how they should treat them, but it's just so that we don't have any conflicts. You be nice to me and I'll be nice to you. There are also those who live by a bronze rule. And there was a lady named Mary Sisney who wrote a book called The Bronze Rule, in how I live my life and let other people live theirs. Her real principle for living that she was advocating is if they're not bothering you, don't bother them. In other words, you mind your business. And it's another one of these negative things that say, you take care of you, I'll take care of myself, and we'll just leave each other alone. And it may avoid some conflicts, but there's got to be something better than that. Now, Psychology Today, however, an article there indicates that we're probably best described by the bronze rule. Do unto others as they have done unto you. We can choose to live in one of two basic ways, and besides the illustrations that we've been talking about. You can either be reactive to your environment, to the people that you live around, to what you see in the world, or you can be proactive. You can either let other people determine how you are going to behave. If other people are nice, maybe you'll be nice. If other people are generous, then maybe you'll be generous. On the other hand, if other people hurt you, then you're likely to hurt them back. And so if you're living in that reactive way, then you're really giving other people control over your character. And that's the way many people tend to live. And people retaliate when they feel like people have not been fair to them. When they don't feel like they're treated well, there's the tendency to want to get even. And that's the way many people live. And on the other hand, we can be proactive. Now, if we're reactive, Well, this is where the problems come in. If somebody has grown up in an abusive home, if somebody has alcoholic parents, or if somebody has grown up in situations where they really haven't been treated fairly, then it's hard for them to learn how to treat their families and people around them any differently. And if we're going to be reactive, then whatever problems there are in our environment or our relationships, we're just going to pass those out down to others, and things are just going to repeat themselves over and over again. On the other hand, if we are proactive, if we decide whatever foundation I use, I'm going to choose the principles that I live by, this is going to be the basis of my decisions, then we're taking charge of our own life and our own values and our own character, rather than letting the world around us decide how we're going to handle things. And this is what really gets us to what Jesus was teaching. When he's saying here that treat people the way you want to be treated. It means that you're not basing what you do on what other people have done, but rather you're trying to determine what the best principles are for you to live by, and let that be the foundation for your life. Now, these same ideas of using different metals in order to describe behavior can be described somewhat in this way. You can have the bronze rule, and that is, what is mine, and I'll keep it. On the other hand, you have the iron rule, and that is, what's yours is mine, and I'll take it. Or you can have the golden rule, what's mine is yours, and we'll share it. And that's not the kind of value system that just naturally comes from our environment. The other rules, the other ways of living, whether it's silver or bronze or iron, these are based on human wants, human preferences, human philosophies. You've got different advocates, like, just for instance, you've got on the iron rule, you've got all the way back toward the beginning of human history, you've got Cain, who wound up killing his brother. He wouldn't have done that if he thought his brother was bigger than he was and stronger than he was. He decides, I'm resentful of the fact that God is happier with my brother Abel than he is with me, and I think I'm big enough in order to put him in his place, and so he used this iron will of his own in order to destroy his brother. You've got military leaders like Alexander the Great, who definitely built their empires on force and the power that they felt like they could wield. Julius Caesar, his military prowess and his military accomplishments are well summarized by some words that are familiar to many of us. In Latin, it says here that vidi, vici, and veni, vidi, and vici. I'll get it right here in a second. Which translated means I came, I saw, and I conquered. Which means that Julius Caesar determined that he saw what he wanted, and he took it and had the power in order to do so. One of the things that advocates the iron rule as well is the philosophy of Charles Darwin in advocating natural selection, in saying there that the basic principle that the world operates by is survival of the fittest. And among much of the animal world, it's true that that's the way things work. The strongest are the ones that survive. But one thing that makes us different from the animal world is that we can choose what principles to live by. We're not out just to seek our own survival. We're not out just for ourselves. We can choose to treat people kindly or patiently. We can choose to forgive people. We can choose to help people. We can choose to put off our own satisfaction for the sake of somebody else. And those are decisions that the animal world can't reflect in the same way we can. Considering then the options that people have in deciding how to live, considering the thing that Jesus taught, if we agree that Jesus is one that we must listen to, and even though world philosophy may say that, no, this golden rule is just not practical, people just don't live that way, we can choose to live by this if we have confidence in Jesus. Jesus is the one who, as God in the flesh, could say, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Jesus was divine power living for a while in a human form. And so Jesus' authority is one that we need to take seriously. And when Jesus says, treat people the way you want to be treated, that's something that we need to take seriously. And Jesus isn't teaching something that's not possible. I want us to consider the question for a moment. What is implied in the golden rule? It's not something that's going to come up naturally. It's something that you only do when you believe in the value of the one speaking it, the importance of the one saying this. The golden rule is something that comes from divine mind, not from a human mind. And if we consider the golden rule, treating people the way we want to be treated, what does this really involve? Well, first of all, it involves what we read in Ephesians 5 and verse 1, where we're told there, be ye imitators of God and walk in love as beloved children. John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Romans 5 and verse 8 says, God commends his own love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, none of these things are for God's own personal advantage. The things that Jesus did on the cross, the suffering that he endured, the sacrifice that he made, all of the things that God did were for our benefit, not his. Expressing his love for us and choosing to do what is for our well-being rather than for himself. In Matthew 5 and verse 43 through 48, where Jesus is contrasting divine principle with the principles that many people want to live by, which is love your friends and hate your enemies. But Jesus says there, love your enemies. Pray for those that don't treat you right. And in the context, as trying to help us see whether or not it's even possible to do this, he says when you do this, you're being like God. Because God sends rain and sunshine on both the righteous and the unrighteous. God doesn't just provide for the people that care about him. Whether people are good or bad, everybody all over the world benefits from the natural order that God has created. We all depend on the same principles. The crops grow, the seeds grow, the things that are planted, and rain and harvest and sunshine, all of these things go together as a reflection of God's concern for people. And both righteous and unrighteous benefit from that. But Jesus is saying there that rather than being like the rest of the world, it's no big deal if you're just nice to the people that are nice to you. But if you're trying to be nice to the people, even that aren't nice to you, you're being more like God. We can be sons of our Father in heaven. In Romans chapter 15, we're taught there not just to please ourselves, that the strong should bear the infirmities of the weak. We're here to help each other. That's how we reflect our gratitude for God's love. That's how we are reflecting his character. In the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we're told there that people are created in the image of God. That doesn't mean that we physically look like him, but we have a moral nature as he does. And we're capable of reflecting his character. And when we're not just looking out for ourselves, but when we're choosing to do things that are good for the people around us, we're reflecting the character of God. Just some other things that go along with this same idea of what's implied in the golden rule. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 through 30, husbands specifically are said, love your wife, just as Christ loved the church. He said people don't hate themselves, they love their own flesh. And what's natural for us is, if we're hungry, we find something to eat. If we're thirsty, we want something to drink. If we're tired, we try to get some rest. If we're lonely, we try to find somebody to talk about or talk to, to share our relationships with each other. And loving our family, loving our husband, loving their wives. This is an invitation of what Jesus did for his church. Jesus willingly gave himself on the cross for the spiritual well-being of his people. And it's saying this pretty strongly to say that husbands are to love their wives just that much. The book of Ephesians chapter 4. I want to look just a little bit at this. We don't have a whole lot of time left. But in Ephesians chapter 4, you've got several relationships and several different behaviors that are mentioned. And first of all, it says, put away lying, because we're members of another. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, because you're giving the devil the opportunity to get the best of you when you do that. Let no corrupt speech proceed from your mouth, but such as is good for edifying. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Now get rid of bad feelings. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. And so in these verses here, it urges us to be truthful. Don't we want other people to be truthful with us? To not let our temper get the best of us, being patient with other people, because we want them to be patient with us too. Be honest, and be kind, and be forgiving. We could spend a lot of time talking about that, but remember that Jesus, in what we call the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, says, as we're praying to God, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And Jesus, explaining this then, says that if you're willing to forgive others, God's willing to forgive you. If you're not willing to forgive others, don't expect God to forgive you either. This is one of the things that God expects us to take very seriously. We've noticed several times in this series of lessons in Romans chapter 12, be not fashioned according to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We're talking about things that may not be easy, that may not be what's most common, and it makes a lot of choice, or it requires a lot of choice for us to decide that we're going to live by God's will rather than what society does around us. But we need to trust Him enough that we reflect that character. I want to read just a few more verses from one context, and we'll wrap this up with this. In 1 Peter chapter 3, the Apostle Peter's been talking about relationships. And starting with verse 8, he says, to sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. For the one who desires life to love and see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And we take those things most seriously when we are willing to let Jesus guide us into the way of life that is best for us, for others, and most honors God. And that is, practice the golden rule. Treating people not as they have treated you, but be willing to be proactive. Take the first step in treating people right. Treat the people the way you want to be treated. And in this way, you're pleasing God. I appreciate you listening. May God bless you.